I represented a title company, and I can't think of the name of the company, but it was one of the bigger title companies. And as a matter of fact, the largest fee I ever made practicing law was from a title insurance policy, because there was a subdivision that was developed between Jonesboro and Hodge, Louisiana, and I got to write the policy on that. And I really got a whopping good fee. And I like to do title work when I practiced law. I enjoyed it because it was interesting, it was educational, it was frustrating, but it was everything you could do to help somebody at certain times. I remember one of the most exciting things that happened to me was I was helping a African-American couple try to salvage the property that they had down in Wynn Parish, and they had borrowed more money than they had and could pay back against the property. And the bank had gone just as far as it could, and they filed suit and put the property up for sale. We needed, I think, $37,000 to pay off the debt to the bank, and we got authority for $37,000. However, there were some additional costs they hadn't told us about, and we went to the sheriff's office, and in the midst of the sale, we found out that we needed more money than we had, and so we had to let the property go. And when we put in our final bid, the other people, the bank put in its bid, and it was higher than ours, and so the family knew we weren't going to be able to keep the property. But there was a blood-curdling scream that occurred in the sheriff's office there, and one of the ladies almost fainted, but she was just so upset about losing their property, and I felt sorry for them, et cetera, et cetera. But in a few minutes, the fellow from the bank came over to me and said, "Mr. Henry, we don't want that property. And if those people can come up with that $37,000 or whatever it was, we'll let them keep the property if they'll give us the oil and gas rights, because that's what we're so interested in." Well, I couldn't believe it, but that's the way it worked out. The people got to keep their property. The bank got its money, and everybody lived happily ever after. But my relationships and about dealing with title companies and title lawyers has been a good one. But you all obviously figured you needed some help several years ago, and you're making some changes in your program, and that's when we became acquainted. This occasion today is especially good for me because it allows me to at least see Linda Allwood once again, because Linda and I worked together when I was Commissioner of Administration for 4 years up there. Linda was one of the Assistant Commissioners of Administration, and there's not anybody I've ever known that's more competent than she is, and few are as competent as she is, and she was always a joy to work with, and became a good friend of mine. So it's nice to just say hello to Linda again, and just see her on this. This is a very uncomfortable situation for me because I've never done it this way. But Linda, I guess you're out there somewhere. But your association has been good to us. We've had a good relationship with you, as far as I know, for a number of years, and I look forward to having many years ahead of us. But you obviously had decided when you came to us that you needed some help in the legislature. And it wasn't long before y'all took to it like a duck to water, because you got really involved and you came to the legislature, and you would come to the committee meetings and you would testify before those committees, et cetera, et cetera. And it wasn't long before you were doing a lot of the work yourself, but it's been a good trip. I'm not sure exactly what all we did to get together, but it's been a good relationship, and I appreciate it. You must wonder sometimes with this particular the virus that we have facing us in this country and in the world. What in the world are we doing fooling around with legislation and the legislation? Because you have to violate everything you're not supposed to do, go into crowds, et cetera, et cetera. But you've done a good job of it, and you must wonder how you got involved in the business. I've thought that a lot of times. How did I get involved in this, and why did I do this? And I was in the legislature 16 years, as they said in my introduction. But I decided in my life, my young professional life, that I wanted to do something to help make some changes in the law of Louisiana. And you can't make changes in the law unless you fool around with the legislature to some extent. So in 1968, I believe it was, we had elections in the state. This was the second election of John McKithen. And I think I was 32 years old. And I have to confess that for some reason or other, I know not what, I always wanted to be in the legislature. I knew they made laws, and I knew they could make changes. And I was influenced to some extent because Jimmy Davis, who had been governor of this state twice, was from Jackson Parish, and I knew Governor Davis very well. He was an old man, but he was a good friend of mine, and I got very well acquainted with him in my later years. But Earl Long had been governor a couple of times, and he was a very colorful governor and a good governor in many ways. A lot of folks didn't like him, but he really did care for people. And I saw that you could make some changes, that you could do some good. And so first chance I got, I ran for governor. And it was after a reapportionment. Reapportionment, you're probably familiar with it, but I think it's every 10 years the legislature has to reapportion itself. That is, they have to shuffle the deck with regard to the 105 House members they have and what the districts are going to look like. And the districts usually change, and everybody gets nervous about, well, where am I going to end up this year? Well, they have reapportioned the legislature in 1968. And whereas Jackson Parish and Bienville Parish, the parish to the west of it, had always had their representative and did have a representative, after the reapportionment, they were to have only one representative for the two parishes. So each of the representatives that had run the year before, or this term before, ran. They were older gentlemen. One of them was real old. One of them was he wasn't old, but he was up in years. And the two of them ran. Then another businessman from Jackson Parish ran, and there was a young lawyer from Bienville Parish, that's north of Jackson Parish. And I ran for that seat. And in the first primary, we eliminated everybody but the two young lawyers. And I was successful in defeating the lawyer from Bienville Parish in the second primary. But in those days, we had to run against the Republicans. So I had to run it off with a fellow that I had given me a job right after I got out of law school, after I got out of college. And I had worked for him as a carpenter's assistant until I could go to law school in the following fall. And he ended up being my opponent in the general election. And I was successful to be elected, and very proud and very happy and very excited. Things changed a little bit when I got to Baton Rouge. On the way down here, my wife and I were talking a lot, and I was thinking, all these problems we have in this state, with me being down there, I could probably have these problems resolved within the next 6 weeks. Well, it wasn't quite like that. And I had an experience like I had never had. There were 105 House members that year. Most, or many of them were young, like I was. There wasn't but one African American elected, and that segregation was a big issue in those days. One African American, it was Dutch Moriel, who was elected from New Orleans, was the only African Americans in either the House or the Senate. There was only one female in the legislature at that time, and it was Lillian Walker, who was from East Baton Rouge Parish, and she was reelected in that session. But there was no other women in the legislature until Dorothy Mae Taylor replace somebody for a House seat later on in that 4-year term. But I was glad to be there, but I was really sort of set back by the lack of organization and the way the system was run. One thing that really upset me is I read in the newspaper a couple of weeks before we convened the legislature that year that John Sidney Garrett was going to be the Speaker of the House of Representatives. Well, that just floored me. How did this come about? The House, I thought, elected the House Speaker. Well, not in those days. It never had, and the governor always named the House Speaker, and the governor appointed John Sidney Garrett, so he was the Speaker of the House, and he was the man that I dealt with on my committee assignments, et cetera, et cetera. So I came to Baton Rouge and got acquainted, and he told me what committees I was going to be on. I know transportation and highways were one, and I asked him to be on the Judiciary Committee because as a lawyer, I felt like maybe I could be of assistance there. So I was on those two committees and was all dressed up and ready to go to work. But so many problems I thought existed because there was little organization and not much follow through on the procedure of the House of Representatives. For example, the Speaker would announce that we'll convene in the morning at 10 o'clock. And you could get there at 10 o'clock and you might not have a majority. The Speaker might not show up to 12 or 1 o'clock. And, that was time wasted, I thought, because we had a session of 60 days. If we didn't get it done in 60 days, we didn't get it done. We had a situation where just about anybody could walk on the floor of the House of Representatives without a sergeant in arms or anybody saying, no, you can't go in there. You're not elected. And we just can't let everybody on the floor of the House. We even had children that would come on the floor of the House and sit with their parents. And, I'm for children, and that's all real well and good. But I didn't want one of my children coming to my office sitting in there. It would be all right if they did it in my office, I guess, because it was private. But if you had 105 people in that office, you wouldn't want 105 children there. We had that going on. And it was you even had people eating on the floor. I remember one time that when we didn't get started like we were supposed to, and all of us were sitting there waiting on the Speaker to call us in session. And it was about 2 o'clock when we started that afternoon, and everybody was starving to death. And somebody went down to the pastime and got a large box of po' boys and came in and started throwing them over the way. It looked like a football game going on in there. And people didn't like the legislature anyway, and we weren't doing anything to improve it. Those of us who were the new representatives, we were young. We thought we could change the world, and we began to talk to one another and began to see what we could do to help reorganize the House better, to help some decorum. That was the watchword, decorum. We needed some decorum in the House. We needed to run the House of Representatives in an organized fashion. So if we announced to somebody that their bill was going to be heard in the Ways and Means Committee the next morning at 10 o'clock, they lived in North Louisiana, that they would have word the afternoon before so they could get down here. Well, the problem was we didn't give notice of when committees were going to meet. Generally, committees met when the House adjourned, but you didn't know whether your committee would meet that afternoon or not, so you could let your constituents know what was going on. Well, we didn't like that. We also didn't like the way they handled the first appropriation bill that year, 1962. The young group put together a series of amendments that we were going to try to get adopted to the general appropriation bill. After about 2 or 3 of them had been presented and had been defeated, one of the old heads came out and said, we ain't never had anything like this. Last year, old so-and-so was handling the general appropriation bill, and he presented the bill, lit a cigarette, and before he got through smoking the cigarette, the bill passed. Well, that's not good legislative process. That's not what the folks set us down there to do. And uh, you know, passing the budget was just sort of a joke, and it was a bad joke. There was even one time we voted for a tax bill with nobody in the House chamber but legislators. We had locked everybody out because nobody thought we were going to pass the bill, but we had to vote on it. And the speaker said, well, we don't want anybody to get beat over this thing, so let's do this. Let's get everybody out of the House chamber. We'll lock those doors in the back, and there won't be anybody in here but 105 of us. And we'll have a straw vote, he called it. And we'll see if we can even get close to a half, a majority, rather than the 2/3 vote. And so I thought that was an awful pathway to go. And some of us complained, but the House voted to empty the House chamber with nobody but members of the House in there. They called that thing up for a vote, and about the time they did, they discovered that somebody with the press had left a little recorder running in their door there, and the stuff really hit the fan, and the press just scored us awfully bad for that kind of stuff. And we were getting bad press, and the young Turks were doing what we could to improve the process. We wanted notice in advance of committees that were to be heard. We wanted to know what bills were going to be heard at those committee hearings. We needed to know where those committees were going to meet, et cetera, et cetera. And we began to make some progress. And the press really ate it up. And we probably were running a little faster than we should be running as young people, because we hadn't hardly gotten our feet on the ground yet, but we had a good group that wanted to do good things, and we just didn't want to see that they were wasted. And as we went on through that year, we got the legislative auditor. I don't know how we hooked up with Mr. J.B. Lancaster, but he was the legislative auditor. He knew state government. He knew the finances of state government. He agreed to meet with us once or twice a week early in the morning so we could look over the legislation that was coming up, and he could give us his observation as whether it was good or bad, or we needed to pass it or kill it or amend it, and how we might amend it. And as a result of that, we began to make some progress. But I was appalled by the fact that just about anybody that wanted a job could come by the legislature, and if you could type, well, you could work in the enrolling room and do some work. But we also had some people that were just there and they were just breathing, and that was about all of it. That bothered me. It also kind of irked me that everybody wanted to hire their child to be a page. Every legislator wanted it. Well, we didn't need that many pages. It needed to be an organized effort, and that was one of the things. We also had problems with lobbyists reaching over the rail, or sometimes coming onto the floor of the House without any need to be there. There was no need for us to have them there, and it became a problem. It was sloppy, and the newspapers were eating us up for it. So we began to try to improve the rules about who could come on the floor of the House and when they could come on the floor of the House. And the biggest opponent that we had to some of that was the AFL-CIO. Victor Busey was the head of the AFL-CIO at that time, and Vic was a very bright, hardworking, dedicated man, but he believed he ought to have, and his people ought to have access to members of the House, members of the Senate, whenever they wanted it, and under any circumstances that they wanted to operate. Well, that was just not in the best interest. They weren't elected to the legislature. They had the right to be there. They had the right to lobby, and I wanted them to do those things, but I didn't want them coming on the floor. I didn't want them yelling from the back. And so we we began to adopt some rules for lobbyists to operate under. Now, when I went to the legislature the first time, I don't remember but one or two people who were full-time lobbyists. It's changed a whole lot since then. Thank goodness that we've enjoyed lobbying the legislature for almost 30 years here at Adams and Reese, and we've done a good job for our clients, and we've made a lot of money. But we've been in an organized system, and we have to show our card before we can even get into the Capitol, and we know where we can stand, but we know where the committees are meeting. We know when the committee is going to meet, et cetera, et cetera. And as a result of the work of the Young Turks, we made some of those changes. But I remember in I was elected speaker for the second term that I was there, and I remember in one of the early sessions or days that the legislature was working in that second term, I got a call from Governor Edwards wanting to know if I could meet with him and a couple other people in his office on a Sunday evening and Vic Busey to talk about lobbyists and how we were going to regulate lobbyists and so forth. I told him, sure, I'd be glad to go. And we went to his office, and there was a conversation about, he said, Vic and his people think that they can't be as effective as they could otherwise be because we're tightening the rules too much and we're restricting what they can do, their movement, et cetera, et cetera. And I want to ask you all if you'll suspend or change the rules that you have. Well, there were a couple of other legislators in the meeting, and they agreed that they would vote to change the rule. And the governor looked at me and said, "What about you, big boy?" I didn't hear you say anything. I said, "I'm not about to vote for something like that. We've got a House of Representatives, and a goodly part of our representatives don't want to make these changes because we're operating better, we're more effective, and we're doing a cleaner job." And I just can't. No, sir. I'd been elected speaker by that time, and I said, it's not in our best interest, and it's not in the labor's best interest, and we're not going to do it. Well, it didn't set very well with Busey, but Edmund Edwards, being the kind of personality he is, it didn't upset him. He always thought I was pretty hard-headed anyway, so he wasn't surprised. But they decided to bring it up anyway without telling anybody, and we killed it that time, and we never had any more problems with organized labor. But we did have problems all along until we got some rules for the House of Representatives as to how the lobbyists were to move, where they were to be, and when they were to be there. And we began to look better. I'm not sure whether the quality of public whether the quality of the laws that we passed were any better or not. But we had an interesting 4 years. And then guess what? It was time to run for re-election. And that was in 1972. Bennett Johnston and Edmund Edwards were two of the young people running. And nobody thought Bennett had a chance and weren't sure about Edwards, but when it came down to the second primary, it turned out that Bennett Johnston from North Louisiana was there and Edmund Edwards from South Louisiana was there. And some of us in the Young Turks had decided we wanted to elect the speaker for the coming term. And we were over at the old Capitol House Hotel. There were 8 or 10, I don't know how many of us there were, but we were talking about who wanted to run and who didn't want to run, but what we were going to do and who was going to support who for governor, etc. Well, I was going to be for Bennett Johnston because I knew him, and he and Mary had been friends of Francis and me for a long time. and I was going to be for Bennett Johnson. There was a fellow in the crowd named Dick Giddy from Galliano. He was for Edwin Edwards. He's a good Cajun boy. And boiled down to the fact we finally decided, okay, here's what we'll try with the Young Turks to do. If the man from South Louisiana gets elected, we'll support Bubba Henry for Speaker. We got a South Louisiana governor and a North Louisiana speaker. If Bennett Johnson gets elected, we'll support Dick Giddy. We got a North Louisiana governor and a South Louisiana speaker. And that sounded like a good way to approach the thing to us. And I thought Bennett was going to win that race at the time, and he almost did, but he didn't. And I was on the road and on the phone calling all kind of people to try to get enough votes to be governor, because the speaker had always been appointed, as I said earlier, by the governor. And we just didn't want that to happen again. There were too many things we needed to do and we wanted to do, and we'd gotten a head start on it, and we wanted to keep the ball moving in that direction. And I was in there was a hotel, a motel down on downtown, and I ran into Jim Donlin, who was a young fellow at that time, and he was on Edward's staff. And I told him what I was up to. He said, well, have you talked to Edmund about it? I said, no, I haven't talked with the governor about it, because I go, what am I going to talk to him about? He said, well, I said, I'm not going to ask him to support me. I'm just going to ask him not to support anybody else. He said, well, you need to talk to him. I'm going to get you an appointment with him. And he called and made an appointment for me to visit with the governor. And I went over to meet with him several days later. And he said, how many votes you got? Well, I didn't want to tell him how many votes I had. But and I said, I ought not to tell you this, but I'm going to tell you, and I don't have enough to get there, but I got enough that I can get from what I have to what I need. And he said, I can beat you if I want to. And I said, well, you can beat me, but you'll have to beat me because I've got a goodly set of votes here. And if I go to the post, I'm going to think I can win. But you can't win, I don't believe, with the votes that you have right now and the votes that I would have. And I want you to know I'm not running to run against you. I'm running because I believe in the House and I believe in the people. And you don't have to worry about me. He said, well, who's going to be your chairman of the Ways and Means Committee? And I said, I've made a commitment to Bobby Freeman, good friend of mine, started with us, and he said, well, I wanted Pappy Trish, Rizzy Trish, down the river here. He's got more sense about the budget than anybody else, et cetera, et cetera. And that's who I really would be more comfortable with. Can you appoint him? I said, no, I just told you I've got a commitment to Bobby Freeman. And he said, you can't break that. And I said, I'm not going to break it, but I can tell you how you can do this, because there's a chairmanship that Bobby, I think, would like, another chairmanship. I can give him that chairmanship, and that'll satisfy him, and then I'll go ahead and appoint Trish. Well, that's what we did. Call Bobby Freeman. He was up for it, et cetera, et cetera. So I said, my commitment is. He said, I'm not going to appoint you speaker. And I said, I haven't asked you to appoint me speaker, and I won't ask you to appoint me speaker. But what I will promise you is, if I'm elected speaker, I will work with you to the best of my abilities, trying to pass the legislation you want, unless I have a problem with the legislation. But you're not going to have me nipping at your heels just because I'm the speaker. You're the governor, you're a bigger man. So it worked out, and it worked out very well. And it wasn't long before the new governor came up with the notion that he wanted to have a constitutional convention. We had made a run at a constitutional convention during the first term. Judge Jim Dennis, he's judge now was from Monroe, had offered some legislation for a constitutional convention, and finally the McKittrick administration agreed to let us put together a committee, and it was a very large committee, to draft a new constitution for the state of Louisiana. And it was too big and it was too convoluted, and there wasn't enough direction there that we had when we first started to do anything. And the result of that was, in the previous session, we hadn't gone very far. But Edwards wanted a constitutional convention, and so in that first session of his second term, we passed that bill in the first week of the session. It's the only bill that I remembered in my tenure in the legislature where we passed a bill the week that it was the bill was introduced, because it takes some time to pass a piece of legislation. First of all, you have to file it, and it has to allow file it. That is, you have to file it with the Speaker's office or with the legislature. It has to lie over under the rules. Then it gets referred to a committee, and it gets voted out of the committee. And when it gets voted out of the committee, then it's referred, then it's put on the House for a final vote. If it passes, then the bill goes over to the Senate and goes through the same process. And that was the process we were operating under. Well, we passed that bill in the first week of the second term of Edwin Edwards, and it required us to elect from, I think it was from each of the House districts, 105 delegates to the Constitutional Convention. And there was a provision, I think, for the appointment. I forget whether it's 15 or 20, but the governor could appoint that many additional people for so that there could be appointments made for certain groups of people that would not be represented in the convention without an appointment by the governor to get them there. And it made sense that it would give us some balance and give us some structure, and would include some people that otherwise we're not going to be able to participate in it. And I'll speak a little bit more about the Constitutional Convention in a minute, but I want to talk a minute sort of what it was like politically that first 4 years that we were elected to the legislature. We've got the coronavirus right now, and it's terrible, but we had segregation, and that was the big thing that was going on in 1968 when I was elected to the legislature. It was a good time to be elected to office, but it was sort of a dangerous time, where it was a stressful time. And it was strange the way things were at that time. I've already told you that there was, I think, only one African American in the legislature at that time. There was one woman, and it was real strange, because in those days, at that time, the husband under our civil code stated the husband was the head and master of the community, and women didn't have a lot more rights than African Americans had, in some senses of the word. And we made several changes insofar as the rights of women. A woman couldn't borrow money. She couldn't buy real estate without the approval of her husband. We fixed a lot of that stuff, and we held a lot of other things that were a lot more more controversial. I remember if you rode up and down the highways of the state of Louisiana or Mississippi or any other state in the South, you could see big billboards that said, complaining about the Supreme Court. It was, I think, had say repeal or fire or whatever it said about impeach. It was impeach Earl Warren and the U.S. Supreme Court, and the Ku Klux Klan was everywhere at that period of time. I was surprised in later years to find out how many of my close friends were in the Ku Klux Klan. And I wasn't a Clucker, and they didn't want me in the Klan, and I didn't want to be in the Klan. But I was shocked to find out that the mayor of my little town was in the Ku Klux Klan. The feds broke into a hotel over in Monroe when the Ku Klux Klan, some racial group, was having a convention, and what they showed to the public from there, my sheriff was a member of the Ku Klux Klan. The chairman of the board of deacons of my church was with the Ku Klux Klan. Two fellows that I played golf with every Wednesday afternoon were members of the Ku Klux Klan. I mean, it was ugly. It's hard to believe that a poor woman, after working all day, could get on a bus maybe, but she either had to stand up or she had to go to the back of the bus, even if there were all sorts of seats available. And I mean, the spirit of things were bad. They'd already had, prior to my graduating from law school, I think it was the last year I was in law school or the next to the last year, they'd have special sessions of the legislature, and they'd argue and debate about keeping African Americans out of the white school system. And they were just mean spirited people. It's hard to believe, but the first session, first term in the legislature, and I think it was the first session that we were back, Martin Luther King was assassinated on April 4th, 1968. And 2 months later, Senator Robert Kennedy was assassinated. People were just, white people and black people were just getting up in arms, and it was a good time to be in politics. I thought it was, but it was a bad time for people of the state that to see how we disadvantage the black race. But being a young lawyer wasn't all bad. And being a young legislator wasn't all bad. It was a good time. I wouldn't take anything for the time that I was able to go back home, be a practicing lawyer, and ultimately run for the legislature. I learned a lot as a young lawyer. I had some tough lessons that I did learn, but I remember my mother telling me, so-and-so saw me the other day and said he was so glad to hear you were back here practicing law. It's so good to have good Christian young men back in our community, et cetera, et cetera. Well, I thought, well, that's nice, Mother. And, within a week or two after she and I had that little conversation, I got a call from our sheriff. And he said, I got a old couple that needs some legal advice, and I'm not sure they can even pay for it, but let me tell you what's happened. He said, this fella has bought up some judgments that these people had because they weren't able to pay the bank back for money they had borrowed. He's got 5 or 6 judgments against him, and he's put their property up for sale, and it's going to be sold at a sheriff's sale this coming Saturday morning, and up in Bienville. I don't know. It wasn't going to be in Bienville Parish. I had to go to Bienville Parish to get my motion and order signed. But he said, could you help those people? I said, well, I don't know whether I can, but send them down to see me. And they were just a real fine old couple, and they didn't know how they just had run out of money, and they didn't know how they were going to live if their property got sold. And I began to look through it, and there were some rights that they had that they had not taken advantage of, and they just had to take advantage of those rights. And I explained to them that what we can do is we'll file a motion and order, file it with the judge on Saturday morning, call off the sale, cancel the sale till you've got time to settle to get your stuff together. Because there's some bank will let you have the money to pay yourself out of this if you'll just pay this other back. So anyway, I put together a motion and order, and that Saturday morning I had to go up to Arcadia to get the judge to sign the papers because there was no judge in Jackson Parish, and I got back to Jackson Parish just in time. So with the whole call the sale off, this thing's been canceled. And that was on a Saturday. The first call I got from my office on Monday morning was that prominent businessman, and he called me everything but a child of God. I mean, he was hot in the collar. And his closing, what do you think? Who do you think you're dealing with? You represent those blankety blanks against somebody like me? What in the world were you thinking about? And I said, well, Mr. So-and-so, I guess the best way for me to sum it up is that I'm in the business of suing folks. Looks like this week is your week in the barrel. And he slammed the phone down, and we didn't talk again for over 6 years, I guess. And I shouldn't have handled it like that at all. It was very immature the way I handled it. But I don't apologize for representing that old couple because they had rights. And this businessman knew that, and he had taken advantage of those rights and was just about to really do real harm to them. He and I didn't speak a word for the next 6 years. If he saw me in the car, he didn't nod, and I didn't either. He didn't blow his horn. I didn't blow. He didn't try to run at me, and I didn't try to run at him. But I always felt bad about it because he wasn't a bad man. He was just sort of greedy sometimes. And about 6 years later, we sat down and resolved the problems that we had. And I was glad more ways than one that we did because he didn't live much longer than that. But it was a lesson for me that when you deal with people, irrespective of how ornery we get sometimes, we ought to sort of look at the other person's side of the story and not be quite as judgmental as we are. Lawmaking is a complex process enough without me kicking dirt on somebody or just going out of the way to be insensitive to the problem that somebody else might have. But you all have done a good job for your industry, it seems to me, because you serve as a protection for your industry, an educator for your industry, and if you're not taking care of your business, then nobody's going to take care of it. But you, and nobody can know what your business is unless you talk to the folks that make the laws at the legislature. And you've certainly gotten acquainted enough with the process to do that well, but you have to watch it closely because things can happen fast in the legislature. I recall in my freshman year in the House of Representatives, paper mill in my home district was building a new paper machine to add to the three that it already had, and that was a very costly adventure that they were jumping off into. And after they had signed the agreement with the manufacturer of the paper machine, they found out that the taxes that they were paying for the labor that would be required to build that big old machine were very disadvantaged, much of a disadvantage to them. They were under the wrong tax law, and they were going to pay a real big price for it. But I got a call from the plant manager who wanted to know what I could do to help those people out, and I had no idea. I mean, you know, tax law is my profession, but tax law is out of my realm. But I talked to some of the older folks, and somewhere along the way, that's one of the beauties of the system of government, is that there's always somebody around if you just look far enough that can help you solve a problem. And I mean, they had a big problem for themselves. And somebody said, what you need to do is suspend the law. We're going to be in session here in another 2 weeks. You know, can this thing go on for another 2 weeks? And I said, yeah, we have to do it today. So, well, get you a bill to suspend the law, and it'll take care of it, because the law is going to say it doesn't have any effect. Well, in those days, the way you could suspend the law, it was dangerous, and I didn't realize this until then. This is the process, and this is what happened on the floor of the House and the Senate the day I filed the bill, and the Speaker, introduction of House Bill, whatever it was, without objection, so ordered. Mr. Henry moves to suspend the necessity of having a committee hearing, without objection, so ordered. Mr. Henry now moves final passage of the bill, without objection, so ordered. That bill was passed out of the House of Representatives. Within 30 minutes, we sent it to the Senate. I had my friend Edgar Mutall over there handle it. The Senate, he handled it the same way, and we got it up to the governor, and it was signed, and their problem was all over. Now, that's dangerous. That's when we had a constitutional convention later on, I made sure that we took that provision out of the Constitution, because suspending a law without it going through all of the legislation. Now, this bill went through the process, but I mean, it went through like a shot was fired. It went through in a hurry. But that's you've got to be here. Somebody's got to be here watching your stuff. And you've covered that pretty good over the years, but it's an absolute necessity that you do what you do, and everybody hasn't figured that out yet. But your presence in the legislature is bound to have made a.
Well, Mr. Henry, I know we appreciate everything that you have done in the legislature for us. You've certainly been much more influential than we have. As a woman, I'm very happy that y'all gave us rights, so thank you. We have a few questions, if you wouldn't mind answering them.
Have I talked longer than I was supposed to? I'm sorry if I have.
No, honey, you've not at all. If you want to keep on talking, we will keep on listening. But if you want.
No, I'll be glad to try to answer some questions.
Okay. Well, we had two of our great minds thinking alike. And actually, I had this question too. You know, we get constitutional amendments, it seems, on every ballot that we see now. Do you think it's time for us to do another constitutional convention?
that's not up to me. And I'm not being trying to be cute, but I don't know that I would vote for another constitutional convention this time. And one of the reasons is that uh, people are so strident sometimes now in big issues, and I think a constitutional convention is one of those things that uh, excites people a lot, and they think it's going to serve a lot of problems. We haven't used what we adopted in the Constitution of 1972, 73 yet, and I think it. You know, I said to Miss Norma Duncan, who who uh, Linda used to work with, the day after the Constitution was adopted by the people, I wish we could sit down and do it again right now, just start all over. And I, it would be hard for me. It, I don't think it would solve the problems that probably bother most of us. The legislature can do that right now if it wants to, and I don't I don't think I believe we need another constitutional convention, but if they have one, I'll watch it and vote one way or the other for it.
Very good. Um, Another thing we wanted to know, as a young Green legislator, what tactics did the young Turks use to convince the older legislators to change their ways and introduce decorum and schedules? Did y'all talk one on one with the older guys, or did you like shame them in public?
Well, you don't get anywhere if you shame somebody, let alone if you shame them in public. But we talked to them because they thought we were sort of smart alecky and so forth, and we thought we were doing the right thing, and I guess we thought we knew more than they did. Sometimes we did know more, and sometimes we didn't. But we talked with them because there was no animosity. They just they were used to doing it their way, and it's easy to do it that way. So why not keep up doing it that way? And we wanted a better product when it came out of the legislature than they were producing, and also you ought not to you ought not to act in a way that could sort of bring criticism to your institution. And we were, people would every now and then sneak a little bottle of alcoholic beverages somewhere in that process, and that's not good. And we wanted to do things we could be proud of, not that we could do them just to put them aside and say we had done them. And there was some thought about it. And but the older people, I remember Bob Munson Sr. He's been dead for years, but he was the chairman of the Appropriations Committee, and he had an apartment right next to mine. And he and I would sit out and maybe have a drink at night and talk about the legislature. He just hated what but we haven't done this forever, Bo. Well, you should have been doing it this way, Bob. And I think talking back and forth, they some folks made it, and some folks didn't. But I think even most of the old people realized, because we had some of those old people run for the Constitutional Convention, and they were totally different people in the convention than they were in the legislature.
Interesting. Do you have any tips for us on how to respond when another attorney or legislature kind of is acting as a bully or does some unprofessional things? I'm sure you've encountered this many times in your practice, and give us youngsters a little tip there.
If it's in a committee and uh, I'd go to the chairman of the committee and let him know what's happened. That this is dishonest or this is rude or whatever. And first you talk with the individual. and let them know that you're upset about it. Or if you knew this was coming up, you would have handled it a different way. But communication is important, and in the legislative process, it's absolutely necessary. And it means that you've got to be there all the time so that you can know what's going on. Now you all have us, and we're watching it because every time a bill is filed, every time it moves, we're watching it. But you all are watching it too, and that gives us a better opportunity of resolving the problem. But then you go to the head of the problem and you talk it out because we're grown people. This is America. We don't have to kill one another, but we do have to talk to one another, and we have to give and take. You can't always have your way, and but that's a learning process. I'm better about that now than I was 50 years ago. But it's a learning process too. And we have to want to keep learning, I think.
Very good. You mentioned something earlier about the budget process at that point where people were kind of adding on things and the bill would get passed, in the time that somebody was smoking a cigarette. And things have changed a little bit since then, obviously, with the procedures y'all are put in, which is wonderful. But we've also added the line item veto since that time. Do you think that's made a big change in how things are handled in the legislature, how the process works?
Yeah, it does, because if you line item veto something, it means that only that part that you're vetoing is going to come out of the document, and you don't have to go back and redo the whole piece of legislation. So yeah, it does more good than harm in my judgment. But it can be awfully harmful too if it takes out the guts of the bill.
Let's see. I think we have one other question. I know we've talked about that already. I was also wondering, y'all took strides to remove the lobbies from the floor. We've now got this whole other method of communication with text messaging and emails and all of that. Can you talk a little bit about how you think that might have changed this whole legislative process and whether it's good or bad?
Well, I think the technology is good. Sometimes it's used for bad, but that's just the way the world turns. But no, and I think it's good in that it can let you communicate without having to have maybe a committee hearing or having a gigantic. But I think it's a tool worth having, certainly worth having, but it needs to be used well, and there needs to be some discipline by everybody on these things. And again, that's an individual. You can't pass a law saying how everybody ought to feel about everything. But the process of legislation needs to be open. I'm satisfied that our process for legislation is open, but if you're lazy, it's not good. Or if you say, well, we'll take care of this tomorrow, you better watch out because you'll get it. You have to work, and you ought to work, because in our situation, that's the way we make our living. But it's a good way to work, and you meet some wonderful people that way. You meet some real losers from time to time, but most people are good, and I found most people that I thought I wouldn't like, some of them turned out to be my best friends.
Okay. Well, Mr. Henry, it has been an absolute pleasure to have you here and to hear your stories. We would love for you to come speak to us anytime you want. I personally would love to just take you to lunch and listen to stories.
Not much.
Once this coronavirus is over, we can do that again.
I want to say one other thing.
Sure.
Rob Rieger said I had to do this. He and I were talking the other afternoon about what maybe I ought to be talking about. And I hope I didn't talk too long or ramble too much. But anyway, I was talking about the cost of running for office and raising. I served 3 terms in the legislature over a period of 12 years. I've never had a fundraiser. I never had a fundraiser. And well, how'd you get by with that? Well, my law partner and I paid for it. Now, in the last term that I ran, some people gave me, some lobbyists gave me, some people gave, one person gave me a real big check. I like fainted when I got it. But I had a deal at the office where if somebody paid us the cash fee, I put that in the safe, and that was the campaign fund. And so that's the way my law partner and I finance my campaigns. But I hate the fundraisers right now. I know that people have to have fundraisers, but we used to say you couldn't have a fundraiser during the session. They've changed all that. It's dangerous giving away money during the session when you're trying to pass or kill legislation. But anyway, I just throw that into the pot. And I've enjoyed visiting with you. This is a strange situation here. I've enjoyed it, even though until now I've had to look at myself if I look. But I hope I've served your purpose this morning.
You've been excellent. We have plenty of comments saying that we could all listen to you talk all day. So thank you again. That is our time for this session today. A little reminder, guys, that the code for this session is Henry 800. So write that down to put on your ballot. And thank you very much. I'm going to go off screen right now for whoever is next.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Henry.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Henry. We appreciate you being here.
Thank you.
So we will take, yeah, that's been great. We will take a 30-minute break for the folks that are on the floor can go visit each other on tables, and please take time to go to the exhibitors' booths and to get your answers for Mad Libs so you can go to the beach. Thank you, and we'll see you back about 9:45.